Good afternoon, and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Alana Sivan. We were joined earlier this week by Stephanie Morales, who is the City of Portsmouth's Commonwealth's attorney, and she is also one of 11 elected prosecutors who have been urging the state legislature to end the death penalty. Now, lawmakers took a major step in this process on Wednesday, when the state Senate passed a bill, and today the House of Delegates also voted to pass its version of the legislation. And Governor Ralph Northam has said that he will sign that bill. And so this is a really historic moment because now Virginia is set to become the first former Confederate state to abolish the death penalty. And this also isn't the only transformative piece of legislation that's under consideration in Richmond right now. The House of Delegates and Senate both advanced legislation that would end more than 200 mandatory minimum sentences in Virginia. And that's alongside a package of reform legislation that includes the legalization of cannabis. Now, before I move into this a little bit further, I want to take a step back and describe what mandatory minimum sentences are for those who might not be familiar and sort of describe why they're so harmful. So normally when someone is convicted of a crime, the judge or jury can use their discretion to decide what their sentence is. So they can say that that person should spend time in prison, how much time, or if there should be something else altogether. And they can consider all sorts of mitigating factors, age, circumstances, what sort of trauma that person was under. But when the law says there is a mandatory minimum sentence, all of that discretion goes out the window. The law says we don't care what other mitigating circumstances there are. You must sentence this person to X amount of time in prison at a minimum. And so many advocates have been saying that this is particularly harmful and have been saying that mandatory minimums, like nearly every aspect of the criminal legal system, disproportionately affects people of color. And actually, one of our guests put this so perfectly in an op-ed where she said, decades of racially discriminatory policies and practices have convinced many people of color that there are two systems of justice, separate and unequal. And so that was Stephanie Morales, who is here with us today. She is the City of Portsmouth's Commonwealth attorney. And also with us today is Arlington County's Commonwealth attorney, Parisa Dehghani-Tafti, and Molly Gill, Vice President for Policy at FAMM, all of whom are pushing the legislature to enact these reforms into law. So thank you everybody so much for joining us. And I'm going to start today with Parisa. Parisa, can you tell our audience why this group of prosecutors felt compelled to lobby the legislature to abolish the death penalty?
Well, first of all, good afternoon, and thank you for having us on The Appeal. I think that the public, has been ready to be convinced if we tell them a story that they can understand and believe. And watching for years and years and years as an advocate, because I started out my career working on death penalty cases with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and then worked on innocence cases. And what I realized was that the greatest impediment to reform for all of these years that I was advocating were really prosecutors, and they were objecting to reform, on every level and pushing these mandatory minimums and sort of blocking attempts to really change the system or abolish the death penalty. And so we thought it was really important that, when folks like Stephanie, who paved the way for folks like me to come into office to really speak with a different voice, we thought it was important, now that we actually have a few of us, to get together and really speak to the legislators and speak to the community, because the story has been that blood will run in the streets if we are too soft on crime. But there always have been legislators who are willing and advocates who are willing to show mercy and to do the thing that's both fair and just. And so we came in and we wanted to raise our voices to bring out that being rote tough on crime doesn't actually solve the root causes of crime. And I think we're in a moment now where we can actually step back and look at history and to, as Stephanie said in her op-ed, to talk really frankly and honestly about how so much of our narrative of crime and who commits it and why is rooted in deeply corrosive, deeply destructive, and the deeply false myth of Black dangerousness. And so it's really incumbent upon us to point out that the origin story of the criminal legal system hasn't gone away, but we can rewrite that story.
When I hear you talking about the responses that you've been getting, sort of this blood on the streets argument, this needing to be tough on crime to be safe, I'm assuming that you all have sort of gotten that argument many times. So I'm curious to hear from you. How do you overcome those beliefs, and what sort of tactics have you used to persuade lawmakers on these sorts of reforms in the face of those arguments? And I will.
Yeah. So.
Go Stephanie, go ahead.
I was just going to say that we have to be unapologetically honest about how harmful these types of narratives have been. We have seen, in our country this summer, how the entire nation became aware of some of the things that many of us who work inside the system have been seeing for so long, but we were not able to have honest and open conversations about. And so the disproportionate harm that happens when we do not confront radically the fact that there are systemic components in place, present within our laws that harm communities, that actually subject people to unfair treatment, and that actually, interfere with the lives of many of our community members, we have to be open and honest about how dangerous that is. So the first step is, we have to confront that we have the information now, we have the data that proves that, the death penalty is not something that is conducive to safe communities. We have the data that shows that mandatory minimums are not deterrents. They do not stop people from committing crimes. And once again, they don't make our communities safer. And so when we confront these realities and we realize that there is just disproportionate harm that's taking place in Black communities, communities of color, and marginalized communities, we have to acknowledge that we are not doing it the right way, but that this is how the system has been set up to function. And so for us, it is about doing everything we can to engage in restorative justice, to correct the problems that we know are there, to begin to, reflect a system that we truly can utilize to bring forward positive change and transformative change to actually protect our communities, to keep our communities safe, and not to do harm in a disproportionate manner.
Also, I know that was a question that a lot of folks might have input on. So Parisa, Molly, if you want to jump in on this also in terms of what sort of tactics you've been using to persuade lawmakers on this issue.
Sure. I think when speaking with lawmakers, as well as when speaking with anyone you're trying to educate about this issue, it's good to start with the universal value of public safety. We all want to be safe. And in fact, mandatory minimum sentences actually make us less safe. I too started my legal career in a prosecutor's office and didn't spend a long time there, but was there long enough to see us hand out mandatory sentences that often I frankly thought were just a waste of taxpayer money and a waste of a prison cell. And even if the person deserved to go to prison, sometimes the mandatory sentence didn't fit. And in fact, sometimes the mandatory sentence was absurd. And I thought, surely we could use that prison cell, those taxpayer dollars on someone who is more of a danger, who does need a longer punishment, and actually make the public safer. And so in some ways, I felt like even though my job was to keep the public safe, these tools were being very wasteful and also causing incredible injustice. And I think also we have to be aware of the effect that mandatory sentences have on communities. Communities see these mandatory sentences get handed out. They read the stories like the ones that FAMM tells on our website. You can visit it at famm.org. And they think, this isn't a justice system, this is nonsense. And that diminishes respect for the system. It makes it harder for law enforcement to do their jobs, makes it harder for communities to communicate with law enforcement trying to do their jobs and cooperate with those investigations. And so I think going back to that universal value of public safety, I think another great myth is that if you take away mandatory minimum sentences, no one will go to prison. And that is just a myth. Judges will still have the ability to send people to prison. Virginia still has very long statutory maximums. You can put people in prison for all kinds of crimes in Virginia for a very, very long time. And Virginia also has sentencing guidelines that allow judges to send people to prison and give them sort of a target, a ballpark number of, this is, in most cases, what the right number for a prison sentence will be. So it's not like we're just taking away mandatory minimums and no one goes to prison anymore and judges are now flying blind in Virginia. That is, couldn't be further from the truth.
And so, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, we got these to where these mandatory minimums exist, and where we so overuse the death penalty because of our inability to really listen to victims too, I think. And one of the things that's really important to me and central to the reason why I decided to run and the work that I'm doing is really to stop co-opting the voices of victims and to listen to what they believe will make them safer. And I think Molly's, and I'm saying this just to jump off of Molly's point of, when we use these mandatory minimums and incarcerate people for a very long time, we aren't necessarily making the community safer. And victims know that. Victims know that either, they fear either that there will be some sort of pushback within the community for reporting or for pursuing a case, or they know that a person is going to go to prison for a very long time, disproportionately long time, and then come back to the community, and they're going to come back more broken than they need to be. And so that is what the public safety piece is that Molly is talking about. And it's not victims that are asking for these hugely long sentences. If you sit down and talk to victims, and I don't want to co-opt their voices, and they're not monolithic, but in my experience, when you sit down and talk to victims, the first and immediate emotion is anger. But the longer you sit, the longer you talk to them, the more you delve, the more you ask them what other things they want, there is a wide range of feelings, from anger to guilt even. And there is a wide range of desires. And at the end of the day, I think if we talk to victims, they understand that that they're not going to get their sense of safety back. They're not going to heal just because a certain number is imposed on an individual. And that, what we need to do is really focus, if we want true public safety, focus on rehabilitation, focus on restorative justice, and focus on the things that actually go to the root causes of why people commit crimes.
I'm going to ask you a follow-up question, because I'm really glad that you talked about the conversations you've had with victims, because so often we've heard that same argument, specifically when it comes to the death penalty. A lot of folks saying, oh, families need closure, and sort of not imposing the death penalty doesn't give them that closure. So I'm curious what you have actually found in those cases, and what you say to folks who use that argument.
Well, there is no victim or victim's family in any death penalty case that I ever worked on that felt like there was any closure, because those cases drag on for 10, 20, 30 years. So there is no closure there. And then, I think maybe since I haven't been the victim of what would be a capital offense, I think it's important to look at folks like Judge Rakoff, whose brother was bludgeoned and stabbed to death. And, he held in an opinion that the death penalty is unconstitutional because it violates due process because you can't go back and fix it. Now, that is somebody whose brother was the victim and killed by a violent crime. If you look at the folks in our General Assembly who just voted in favor of abolishing the death penalty. You have Janet Howell, who on the floor of the Senate said that she was a supporter of the death penalty until her father-in-law was killed. And that this assertion that the death penalty is there for the satisfaction and healing of victims, she said is totally wrong. We heard the same thing from Delegate Kathleen Murphy, whose family also was the victimized, and she also came out and said that this is not in the interests of victims. And so I think that if we're truly listening to what victims say, we have a lot of examples. They just don't happen to be the most vocal examples, generally speaking, that this is not something that victims want. They may want revenge out of a sense of anger, but that is not, like I said, the sort of overwhelming feeling that they have. There's a whole range of feelings. And if we allow them to feel those things, we can actually hear what they need and create support systems that actually heal them, instead of watching a case drag on for years and years, appeal after appeal. And then, to watch somebody die doesn't really, like, their loved one isn't back. All of this trauma that they've suffered doesn't suddenly get wiped away. And so I think it's a very simplistic view to say that this is for victims.
Stephanie, I want to turn to you. Can you talk to us a little bit about how abolishing the death penalty could address or will address the larger question of harsh sentencing?
Yeah, so the death penalty, I don't think it gets much more harsh than that, subjecting someone to loss of life in a very inhumane way as a result of, a purported crime. And as my counterpart in Arlington mentioned, once you take someone's life, you cannot bring them back. And so that is the harshest of punishments that we can, even talk about. And when we were talking about this earlier in the week, a very important component of that discussion was the reality that, the death penalty has been meted out in a way that has been, dramatically, disproportionately applied to Black people and to people of color. And so when we're talking about the harshest of punishments and that disproportionality in conjunction with the reality that it does not make our community safer and that it drains the resources that could otherwise be sent to, correct some of the harms that are resulting in people not having their mental health concerns addressed, which we've seen, people who have severe mental health related issues ending up in that position where they have, been convicted of capital murder and subjected to capital punishment. And so we have to think about the impact that they have, not just on that person, not just on the victims but on our entire society. And so repealing the death penalty, removing that opportunity as a state to sanction the killing of members of our community who have ended up in this position for whatever reason, as the method of holding them accountable, repealing that places us in a position where we rethink, the things that we're doing and why, and making sure that we are lining up our intentions, which are to have safe societies, and our actions. And so I think that's what it does. It gives us this opportunity to look at the actions and the harms of the past and to ensure that going forward, we are not continuing to harm the members of our community who have done wrong and who do need to be held accountable, as we are trying to heal those who have been victimized and trying to keep our community safe. So it is a step in the right direction of becoming a better system, becoming the type of system that, as the United States of America, where we're seeking liberty and justice, we should have a criminal justice system that reflects that. And right now, I think we have a criminal legal system that does not result in justice for all, but instead justice for those who have resources. And, quite frankly, those who get breaks when many other members of our society don't have that opportunity.
It's your answer really sort of reminds me why I keep sort of going back and forth between questions between the mandatory minimum sentences and the death penalty, because we're seeing how, when you make it so that this harsh sentence is no longer available, it could have this this sort of effect on other sentences where we change a system so that it's fairer. Which brings me to my next question, which this one will be for Molly, but again, anybody can always jump in. How would passing this law sort of change the way that prosecution works in Virginia? So how do you see your job being different? And you did touch on this a little bit earlier, but I'd like to hear a little bit more.
Sure. I mean, one of the reasons that prosecutors oppose any reforms to mandatory minimums so strenuously, except for the prosecutors I'm here with today and their coalition, is that mandatory minimums give prosecutors enormous power. They give them enormous power to decide the sentence in many cases. It's very fair to say that mandatory minimum sentences turn the prosecutor into the judge, jury, and executioner in a case. When you're a prosecutor, you decide what to charge a person in an office, in a closed room. The judge isn't there, the defendant isn't there. No one's looking over your shoulder to make sure you're being fair or impartial or even reasonable, and you decide what to charge that person with. And often mandatory minimum sentences are preferred charges because you can then walk into a plea negotiation with a defendant and say, here's what I've charged you with, and it carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 5, 10, 15, 20 years, even life without parole. But if you plead guilty, I will change these charges to something else that does not carry a mandatory sentence, and you'll get a much lower punishment. And we call that the trial penalty. If you decide to exercise your constitutional right to a jury by your peers to be proven guilty by proof beyond a reasonable doubt, that can carry enormous consequences for you. If essentially you tell that prosecutor, no, I want to use my rights, I want a jury to decide, you have locked yourself into those mandatory minimum sentences that the prosecutor has brought against you. And so mandatory minimum sentences are a sledgehammer that prosecutors use to pound people into submission during the plea negotiation process. I'm not exaggerating, there is no nicer or more subtle way to describe it. And that imbalance of power is inappropriate and wrong for our justice system. We have a system of checks and balances where the judiciary gets to check the executive, where that judge gets to have some discretion at sentencing in the case the executive has overstepped. And mandatory minimums completely take that power away from the judge and create this horrible and unjust imbalance of power in courtrooms.
When you're talking about prosecutors sort of using these as a tool to submit people into the pleas that they want them to take, I'm imagining that not all prosecutors are as wonderful as the ones who we have here in sort of supporting this reform legislation. So I'm curious to hear sort of what opposition you've seen to these reforms, where it's coming from, and sort of how you've dealt with that. And this is sort of an open question, but I will turn it to Parisa, and other folks always welcome to jump in.
Honestly, I feel like Molly would be the better person to talk about where the opposition was coming from. What I can say is that another piece of the problem, at least for prosecutors, is that having mandatory minimums makes for a measure of inaccuracy, and it's really frustrating. When I look at a charge that is accurate and reflects what actually happened, but then it has a mandatory minimum that is completely disproportionate and doesn't take into account who any of the human beings are and what any of the actual people that are involved in the case want for the case. And so it produces this situation where I have to charge strangely, or we have to explain to a judge who doesn't understand and doesn't know all of the facts and shouldn't necessarily know everything. Like, for example, if a person cooperated, you don't necessarily want that in the public record. But it makes for this sort of strange situation where we're jumping through hoops and doing things that are kind of inaccurate, in order to try to get a little bit of subtlety and nuance and actual satisfaction for the folks who are involved in that case. so that they won't be subject to something that, you know, neither the victim in a case wants nor is proportional or what the defendant needs.
And let me just add very briefly that, you know, when we talk about opposition, you have to acknowledge the fact that there are many people, legislators, Commonwealth's attorneys, and any and everything in between, who want the status quo. We have to acknowledge that there are people who are completely fine with the way things have been operating. And that is a large part of the reason why we founded Virginia Progressive Prosecutors for Justice, because between the number of us who are counted in that organization, we represent over 42% of the population of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so when you have over 100 Commonwealth attorneys and people are lifting their voices up and they're standing together in number, you know, we had to look at the fact that we represent a large number of the population, and we had to make our voices heard. Our constituency elected us because of the values that we hold. And so I've held these values, you know, since 2015 when I first got elected, and I will continue to push the envelope. But it's important to talk about the fact that, you know, opposition will never come in the form of one singular person. There will always be people who are there to protect the status quo.
Absolutely. And Molly, I'm going to turn to you because Stephanie was just talking about sort of the folks in the opposition who are sort of committed to preserving the status quo. And so I'm interested to hear from you, especially since Parisa shouted you out as the person to talk to about this, in terms of the opposition you've seen.
Well, FAMM works in numerous states around the country, and Virginia is just one of those states. And it's just stunningly predictable who is going to oppose your sentencing reform bill when you walk into the legislature to start talking to lawmakers about it. It is always going to be prosecutors. Often it's also sheriffs, law enforcement. And some of this is just, again, that self-preservation of power. I was just in Arizona, and there's a reform there where they're considering scaling back some of their mandatory sentences. And it was really refreshing because one of their county attorneys, Kent Volkmer from Pima County, came in and testified in favor of the reform and said, you know, I know this is not going to be something that all the prosecutors in my office support, and I know it's going to deprive us of power, but I think this is the right thing to do. I think we need individualized justice. And it was, like I said, incredibly refreshing to see a prosecutor come in and say that. So it is I think still the exception and not the rule to see prosecutors oppose mandatory minimum sentencing reform. I think some of this is just a lack of innovation, lack of imagination about what the system could be. And that is partly because for the last 30 years, our approach to everything has just been incarceration and more of it. And so it's good to see groups like Stephanie's coming out, really training prosecutors to think differently and more holistically about the tools at their disposal, to think about what are the goals the criminal justice system should be achieving. And if we can achieve public safety without sending someone to prison, let's do that. If we can achieve public safety by sending someone to prison for less than we're currently doing, let's do that. If incarceration is excessive in our state, let's take a hard look at that. And I think we're starting to see more of that conversation happening. But by and large, when I go to a Capitol to lobby on a bill, I'm still expecting to run into opposition from the prosecutors.
And Molly, just a follow-up question to that, sort of zooming out and looking out the South as a whole, are there other states where you're seeing that there could be change? And also, if you could talk to us a little bit about how mandatory minimum sentences have fueled mass incarceration in the South.
Sure. I mean, in the South as well as all over the country, the mass scale creation of mandatory minimums starting in the 1980s essentially strapped judges into a system where you had to send someone to prison, and you had to send them there for a long time. And when you do that, your prisons fill up, and you have to build new prisons and keep building new prisons. And that is what happened throughout the 1980s, 1990s, and really we've only just started to turn that ship around a little bit in recent years. Some other places where we're seeing mandatory minimum reforms pass is last year, North Carolina passed a very minor exception to mandatory minimum sentences for nonviolent offenses. That's a similar reform is on the table in Arizona. There are multiple bills in the Oregon legislature right now to look at scaling back or removing their mandatory minimum sentences for what they call Measure 11 offenses, which are by and large pretty serious offenses. Really what I would say is a lot of the sort of low-hanging fruit, the nonviolent offenses, the drug offenses, those mandatory minimums have been repealed or significantly reformed in many, many states. More than 30 states over the last 15 years have done mandatory minimum sentencing reform. And so what is left are some of these more difficult crimes, I think, to talk about. You have to educate people a little bit more. You do have to listen to victim voices and recognize that they're going to come and have questions about what you're proposing when you want to eliminate a mandatory minimum, like, for example, sexual assault or just plain assault. So I think, the conversation is getting, more nuanced and more difficult as reforms progress. But that is exactly the direction we should be going in. Even for the most serious offenses, I would not want a one-size-fits-all punishment that the judge was required to use. Too many important facts and circumstances of individuals would be discarded, and justice would not be achieved in every single case. And I would rather have judges with the power to have that flexibility and come to a right conclusion than be able to say, oh, look, we're throwing everyone away because they did X for 20 years. Like I said, that doesn't necessarily make me feel safer, and I don't think that makes our justice system fairer either.
So this last question, I'm going to ask everybody, but I'm going to start with Stephanie. What are the next steps for reforming the Virginia justice system if these laws pass and if Governor Northam signs them? What's one priority that you plan to focus on next?
So for me, I will only speak for myself here. I think we have to continue to look at this as a marathon and not a sprint. And we have to continue to push for transformative change constantly. We cannot, settle. We cannot get satisfied. We can't feel really good about ourselves and stop moving forward. So if we are able to accomplish, ending the death penalty and ending mandatory minimums, we need to look at how to create opportunities for second chances, opportunities to have true expungements. If we're going to legalize marijuana, we have to look at how we create opportunity in that industry for, again, Black communities, marginalized communities who have been disproportionately impacted by drug laws. We truly just have to look at, again, everything that has caused harm, all of the racial disparities, all of the systemic racism. Again, we have to continue to push for police accountability. Everything related to transparency, investment in our community. We talk about the criminal legal system and we don't talk about ending food insecurity, having opportunities for housing, having educational opportunities, healthcare resources. We don't talk about all of these things and how they tie in and relate to the criminal legal system, but they truly do. And so when we look at all of these issues to change the legislative, function around the criminal legal system, we have to be looking at this from a holistic approach, and we can never stop. We can never stop. There is just truly, a history in this country of violence. There was nothing that has been done to move away from how this country was founded, how this country treated Black people and marginalized communities. And we have to do everything in our power to reconstruct the fabric of this nation to something that reflects, an ability, a place where people will have an ability to thrive. And so that is my call for action, is that we never let up, that we never get comfortable, and that we always continue to push for transformative change in every way possible and in every area possible.
I will turn it to Parisa to add on to that.
I am not sure that I can say it any better than Stephanie just did. I agree with everything that she said. We can't just change a few laws and then expect the system to suddenly turn into something that it's never been. Our system is designed is functioning the way that it was designed to function, and tinkering at the margins, which is really what we're doing until we make transformative change, until we have a different view of what is accountability. we're just tinkering at the margin. So like everything that we're doing is necessary, but we cannot stop there. We have to address the fact that we spend more money. The only thing that we spend more money on than prisons in this country is war. So number one is war. Number two is prisons. Not education, not housing, not healthcare. That is what we need to fix. And there's absolutely no reason why that shouldn't cut across every kind of political ideology. Because, if you believe in public safety, like as a conservative, you have to look at the, fiscal conservative, for example, you have to look at, the money that we've been spending and say, like, are we actually getting the results that we were promised from, if you're, a person of faith, do we really function in a system that has any room for accountability and rehabilitation and redemption? If you're a libertarian, why does the government have so much power and so little due process? And, so wherever you are on the ideological spectrum, these reforms make sense. And giving people security and housing and food and healthcare, those are the things that actually prevent crime from happening. And those are the things that we should be investing in.
Molly, I'll have you take us out. Talk to us about your next legislative priority.
Sure. I think speaking for the families that FAMM represents, the first thing they would say is don't leave us behind. Often we pass these reforms and they're not retroactive. And, everyone pats themselves on the back and says, yay, future generations won't be sentenced this way. And we forget all the people who are already in prison doing unjust sentences, excessive sentences, and we don't give them the opportunity to go before a court and make their case that, in fact, I am ready to be released. I am a safe person for our community. I'm ready to go rejoin society. And in fact, my sentence was unjust, and justice demands that I get fair treatment. If a manufacturer makes a defective product, they do a product recall. Everyone sends back their broken bike. Unfortunately, the criminal justice system and lawmakers don't have the same attitude about sentencing reform in particular. And I think some of that is due to this sort of Willie Horton ghost, this specter of someone getting out and committing a terrible crime, and then your opponent uses it against you in your next campaign and you lose your race. And frankly, we have just not seen that happen in recent memory. And I also just think lawmakers, we elect you to show that kind of courage and to do the right thing. I think the other thing we need to do is go tackle these long sentences, these exceptionally long sentences that have been on the books for so long. And we need to give people meaningful second chances. So late last year, FAMM launched its Second Chances agenda. You can learn about it at famm.org/second chances. And we're calling for three things. We're calling for great expansion of the use of executive clemency by governors to reassess some of these long sentences, recognize people who've been rehabilitated, grant them clemency so they can go home. We're calling for greater use of what's called compassionate release, or in many states, medical or geriatric parole. Elderly people are one of the fastest growing groups of people in our prison system. They are one of the lowest risk groups in our prison system and one of the most expensive to incarcerate. And unfortunately, most of the medical and geriatric release and parole systems that exist in the states just don't function very well, and no one gets out. So we need states to reassess those and make those systems better and get people out the door when they reach that point at which they're no longer a threat. And then the last part is we need to create second look laws. We need to allow judges to reconsider sentences after a person has served a certain period of time. So we're seeing these bills introduced around the country. In Congress, Senator Booker has introduced a bill that would allow judges to reconsider sentences after 10 years. In some places, it's more like 15 years, 20 years. But the point is that you serve a certain amount of time and then the judge can reconsider. And again, answer that question. Do you deserve a second chance? Are you ready to come home? And we have for too long just thrown people away. I think as a society, we do believe in second chances. We believe in redemption. I'm a person of faith. I believe in redemption. And we have a legal system that does not allow us to recognize redemption. So that's what the Second Chances agenda is all about. And that's the next place we need to be going.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us. And I will say that hearing all of your last answers, it's such a monumental task that you all helped accomplish. And the three of you are here saying, okay, that's great, but we have so much more work to do. And so I applaud you for your stamina, for your continued work. And thank you so much for joining us and for fighting the good fight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all viewers for joining us as well. I'm still quite impressed hearing how this legislation is moving forward, but how at the same time there's so much work to do, and these are folks who are not only willing but committed to continuing to do that. We know that we have this criminal legal system that harms people, harms families, and it's overspent on, while communities have been while there's been a severe underinvestment in communities in comparison to this overspending on disparate punishment systems. And so, but in the face of all of that, Virginia is on the verge of a major change. Both the Senate and the House have passed legislation that would abolish the death penalty. And they're soon going to be considering the elimination of most mandatory minimum sentences and perhaps legalizing cannabis. And so proponents of these reforms have been saying that this could result in a mass reduction of the people who are incarcerated and the length of time that they spend behind bars. And what's super encouraging about this is where this is happening. This is happening in Virginia, in the South. It is going to become the first Southern state to abolish the death penalty. And in a region that is notorious for overcriminalization, mass incarceration, people are recognizing that this status quo can no longer be the status quo. It is harmful, it is expensive, it is wrong. And people are demanding that their lawmakers do something about it to make sure it changes. And so elected officials, if you want to keep your jobs, should do well to take notice. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining The Appeal Live. I'm Alana Sivan. Follow us on The Appeal News on Facebook and The Appeal on Twitter to get the latest news. Thanks for joining us.